Hi guys, okay, this is Fabiano Caruana with white against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, played at the Candidates Tournament on Monday, and the winner of this tournament will of course face Magnus Carlsen for the world title later in the year. The tournament was stopped halfway through about a year ago due to the outbreak of COVID-19, and when it was halted, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave was tied for first with Nepomniachtchi on 4.5 out of 7, and Caruana was tied for second with Giri and Grishuk on 3.5 out of 7. There were 7 rounds remaining to be played before this round, so it was an important round with regard to the tournament standings. Caruana opened as normal with e4, and then the game went into a Sicilian defense with c5. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, or MVL as he's known, was clearly in the mood for a fight, as he often is, as a brilliant tactical player and the highest rated French player in the world. The game now went into the mainline Neudorf variation, with knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3 and a6, which is one of MVL's favourite weapons against e4. Caruana of course knew this, and it soon became apparent that he'd prepared something against it due to the speed of his play. So next came bishop g5, e6 and f4, threatening e5, exploiting this pin, although black does have some tactical ways out of it. So there's a few ways for black to deal with the idea of playing e5, the main moves being bishop e7 or queen b6, which is what MVL played, attacking the b2 pawn. And this is a very sharp line that Fischer had a brilliant record with, losing only one game with it in his whole career. MVL has been playing it quite a lot recently, but with mixed results. So now we had the main line with queen d2, white's giving up this so-called poison pawn. Now rook b1, queen a3, and this series of moves leaves white with these two weak pawns, which is going to be a problem if black can get the game to the end game, but he has to get there first, and this is the point. White has a huge lead in development and will now look to punish this early queen activity and pawn grabbing, and this process usually begins with either f5 or e5, and Caruana went for the latter with e5. And now MVL played h6, and this is still known theory. Black is going to kick this bishop to an undefended square before moving his knight. So bishop h4, and now d takes e5. Black exchanges to leave white with a weak e5 pawn. So f takes e5, now knight f d7 and knight e4, because this pawn push is dislodged the knight from f6, which makes it possible for white to get this very nicely posted central knight. So queen takes a2. This is the drawback of knight takes e4. This pawn is now undefended, and black can take it with tempo because of the attack on the rook. And we can see immediately some of the danger in the position if black instead snaps off the e5 pawn here. If knight takes e5, knight b5 attacks the queen and threatens mate on d8 with the queen and the bishop. So black would have to play suicidal moves like knight d3 checks, bishop takes d3, now a takes b5, bishop takes b5, knight d7 is best, but now white can simply castle, and the threat of bringing a rook to the d file and exploiting this pin is very difficult to meet. And we can also see what would happen if white were to have a free move a few moves earlier. For example, here bishop e2, and this is a very innocuous looking move, and it's common in the Neudorf variation, and the idea is simply knight takes e6, and there's no f takes e6 or bishop h5 is actually going to be mate in 2, g6 and bishop takes g6. And it's one of those openings where every move is crucial, and black can lose very quickly if he doesn't take care. Alright, so we'll go back to the game continuation, which is queen takes a2, now rook d1, Caruana increases the pressure on the d file. So queen d5 attacks the knight and also the e5 pawn. So it's all still theory. And Caruana played queen e3, which is threatening knight b5 with a discovered attack on the queen, and black is basically forced to play queen takes e5. So black is now up 3 pawns, and he's also threatening here bishop b4 check, which is a bit tricky to deal with if it's permitted. So c3, and now MVL makes use of the pin on the e4 knight and plays bishop c5, which is threatening f5 to force the knight to move and then trade the queens, because he's much happier to get the queens off and play with 3 extra pawns. He'll be winning if he's able to do that. And we can see that he can't do this one move earlier or he's running into trouble. If f5 now, then knight takes e6 and queen takes e4 is best. If instead, for example, queen takes e6 and knight d6 check is mate m5, bishop takes d6, queen takes e6, king f8, and bishop c4 is just crushing. So queen takes e4 is best. Now queen takes e4, fe4, knight c7 check, king f7, bishop c4 check, king g6, and now knight takes a8 is slightly better for white, although black has 2 pawns for the exchange. So one of the ideas of playing bishop c5, as MVL did in the game, is to prevent this whole line by pinning the knight that's on d4 with the queen on e3, and therefore threaten to play f5 and get the queens off the board. So we'll go back to the game continuation, bishop c5, and then Caruana continue with bishop g3, so he's attacking the queen. So the queen has to move, and black is almost consolidated. If he can just get one more move, for example knight c6, then he will indeed be better, but of course Caruana is not going to allow him that, and at move 18 now he played the first novelty of the game with bishop c4, attacking the queen, although the bishop can simply be taken. And it's a sharp move that Stockfish on my lowly quad core doesn't immediately like, but Caruana has prepared this with a much stronger hardware and probably a team of grandmasters. So what's his idea here? Why is he giving up this piece for nothing? His idea is that after queen takes c4, which is what MVL played, comes bishop d6, and threatening bishop takes c5, which is actually winning a piece, because if knight takes c5, then knight d6 check is forking the king and the queen, and this fork also means that black can't now trade bishops. So MVL was happy to give the piece back and played knight f6, although the engine actually didn't like this, preferring instead bishop d4 and giving black a small edge after rook takes d4 and queen b3. And Stockfish just apparently is not concerned with the fact that black can't castle anytime soon and has huge dark square weaknesses, which would be enough to put off most human players. White can continue here with queen g3 attacking the g7 pawn and the knight on b8 in conjunction with the bishop, and black should respond with g5, and it remains a very imbalanced and sharp game. And note that if black plays here instead queen b1 check, king d2, queen takes h1, white is winning by a mile after queen takes g7. So we can see again the pressure that is ready to explode in the white position on this undeveloped black side of the board. Alright, so knight f6 is what MVL did play here, and Caruana continued with knight takes c5, which is pretty much forced, and this is the position that he's played for with his home preparation. He was still making instant moves at this point, and it was clear that he knew the position very well. Black's next move is also more or less forced if he wants to retain a small edge. Knight d5 attacking the queen and forking the pawn on c3 in conjunction with the black queen. And the problem for black is that white is threatening knight f5 after his move knight takes c5, exploiting this pin and on the e-pawn, and is creating this monstrous threat of knight takes g7, which is going to be game over quickly. And the problem of black's dark square weaknesses are very quickly exposed, so MVL must play a forcing move, and knight d5 achieves that due to the attack on the queen. But this knight d5 here. So Caruana continued with queen e5, which is threatening queen takes g7 and just a crushing attack on these dark squares. So MVL played a rook g8 to defend that pawn, and now again, if black just had one move to play knight d7, he would be fine, but again Caruana is not going to give him time, and he continued with a powerful sacrifice, knight d takes e6, which smashes open the black position, removes the defender of this d5 knight, which is under pressure from the rook and the queen, and it threatens knight c7 with double check, which is actually going to lead to mate, so black therefore has to accept. So f takes e6, and now knight takes e6, threatening knight g5, a discovered check and a mating attack, as well as simply to pick up the loose knight. And Maxime now elected to get the queens off the board with queen takes c3 check, and this is the safest option, although the apparently insane knight f6 is also playable, and white has several options that I'm sure Caruana knows very well. 3 different discovered checks are all playable. Is knight takes g7 check, knight f4 check, and even knight d8 check is also good, but remarkably they all have similar evaluations with a small edge to black, although he would need nerves of steel to go down this path. And we may see this in a Caruana game at a later date, and perhaps we'll find out then what he had up his sleeve. In any case, this is a theoretically important game due to the bishop c4 novelty, and it's sure to get a lot of scrutiny in the chess world in the months to come, so it'll be interesting to see what they unearth. But anyway, we'll get back to the game continuation. So queen takes c3 is what Maxime played. So queen takes c3 is forced, and now knight takes c3 is also forced, and the point to Caruana's play is that now he has knight c7 check, winning back the piece and indeed the exchange. MVL played king f7, king d7 is also playable, as with knight f6. It leaves the king open to a lot of tactics, and this is a much more natural and safer option. So rook d3 is an important move to play before taking the rook on a8, because white obviously wants to stay the exchange ahead. So knight e4, MVL decides to remain active. Another option was a rook a7 to retain the material balance. So say for example rook takes c3 and king g6, and black stays simply 2 pawns up, but also remains a long way behind in development, and white has very good compensation as a result. And note that bishop c5 doesn't win the rook due to b6, bishop takes b6, and simply rook b7. So knight e4 anyway from MVL, and now Caruana castles with check, and after king g6 he finally plays knight takes a8, and it's to reach this position that all of Caruana's opening preparation was for, the exchange up for 2 pawns and promising chances for the remainder of the game. So MVL now played knight c6, and he must have been keen to get his pieces developed, but in fact this is a small mistake. Better was rook d8 first, exploiting this pin and more or less forcing rook fd1, and for example bishop f5, bishop a3, rook d3, knight d7, and I imagine it's likely that MVL avoided this line because it's much easier for him to defend if he keeps rooks on the board. So knight c6, and now knight b6. Caruana gets his knight back into the game, and now rook d8, a move too late. It's another small mistake. Bishop f5, preventing white from taking the knight, was better. So knight takes c8. Sorry, from taking the bishop is what I meant to say. And now rook c8 and bishop a3. And Caruana elects to save the bishop from being traded. So rook c7 to prevent rook d7, which would be crushing. So rook f4, knight f6, and now bishop b2, which is a nice move that sets up some tactical ideas with a rook g3 check. For example, if black was to play knight d7 now, then simply rook g3 check, and then taking on g7 is crushing. So knight e7, and MVL would love to play knight ed5 now, but again Caruana is not going to give him the chance, and now exchanged. The bishop takes f6 and g takes f6, and now the advantage of being up the exchange becomes considerably more pronounced. Black is going to have a tough time in this endgame, and it's difficult for him to really get his extra pawns on the queen side rolling without them just becoming targets for the rooks. And Caruana now played a bit of a surprising move with h4, because this allows ideas like h5 and getting the knight to g4, which is quite difficult to break down if black can achieve it. And Magnus Carlsen was watching, and he said he thought h3 instead might be a better move, and the engines agreed with that, and it stops the knight coming to g4 and black being able to set up the fortress type of position. So MVL did indeed respond with h5, and now come rook g3. With white is getting very good compensation for his being down to 2 pawns. And now king f7 and rook g5, just exploiting the pin on the f pawn and threatening simply to take the h pawn. So rook c1 check, king h2, knight g6, forking the rook and the h pawn. And rook f2 is the only move that makes sense, because rook f3 or rook f5 lose tempo, and obviously he has to stay on the f file to maintain this pin. So knight takes h4, and now rook takes h5, attacking the knight. So knight g6, and now rook h7 check, king e6, and rook takes b7, winning a pawn and threatening rook b6 check to win the f6 pawn. And MVL decided on the defense, knight e5, and after rook b6 check, rook c6, which is pretty brave to allow one pair of rooks to come off the board and try to defend. The engine prefers king e7 because the f pawn is temporarily defended tactically due to the threat of knight g4 check if white takes with a rook on f6, and this allows black to keep the pair of rooks on the board. So play might continue here, king g3, knight d7, rook takes a6, and white is definitely ahead, but black can put up a lot of resistance. So rook b6 check, rook c6, and now Caruana got a pair of rooks off the board, and black at least gets to hold on to his a pawn in this continuation, and white will have to spend some time winning it. But and this means that black can attempt to set up a fortress and hold the draw, but there's no need for white to rush here in any way. He can gobble up this pawn whenever he wants to, and now it's going to be a matter of trying to wear black down. So Caruana continued with king g3, and now king f7, and black doesn't ever want to advance the f pawn and is content to sit tight and try and hold with his pieces as they are. There's not going to be any saving the a pawn, so he's going to just set up all of his pieces here, his king, his knight and his pawn, and just try and hold. So rook c2 attacking the knight, knight b4 attacking the rook, rook d2, now knight c6, king f4 and king g6 to prevent king f5. So rook d6 attacking the knight, and this is just going to win the a pawn when it moves. So knight e5, now rook takes a6 and knight f7, and this is the setup that MVL has decided to try and hold the draw, which is indeed incredibly difficult to break down. The engine is giving a draw at the moment, but the point is that there are many ideas that white can try and many ways that black can go wrong, despite the simplicity of the position. So king e4, now knight h6, rook a5, knight f7. As before, MVL is happy to retain the position he has and ask Caruana how he's going to proceed. Many club players, I'm sure, might try f5 check here instead, but this loses simply after king f4, the threat of rook a6 check and taking the knight, taking the pawn, and it's going to be a winning king and pawn endgame. For example, yeah, just as I said, and this is a simple win. Black is lost in any case after moving the pawn, so MVL has clearly seen that that was not the way forwards. So knight f7, and now rook a3 check, and this is a great move because it brings a threat of rook g3 check and king f5, which black has to defend against. So knight d6 check, king f4, and now this f7 square is available for the king in the event of rook g3 check. Otherwise the king is just going to march up and gobble the pawn. So MVL now played knight f5, which threatens rook g3 for one move, so white just has to gain a move. So he plays something like rook d3, and now knight h6, and black has to move the knight here, but this may have been a mistake. The engine thinks knight e7 or g7 was the correct move in order to hold. For example, knight g7, now rook d7, knight h5 check, king g4, knight g7, rook b7, knight h5, rook e7, knight g7, rook c7. White just isn't making progress. All lines in the evaluation are equal, which means it's almost definitely a drawn position. But knight h6 is what MVL played. So rook g3 check, king f7, now king e4, and Caruana finds the only move that leads to a win, only to go wrong on the next move. After knight g8 he played king f5, and this lets black off the hook. Best was rook a3, and after, for example, king g6, rook c3, black's in zugzwang. Let's say knight e7, now rook c5, knight g8, king d5, knight h6, king e6, and the king penetrates, and this f pawn is eventually going to fall, and with it the game. So it's essential that black stops the king penetration on either side, and white can threaten to do that on both sides. So despite being such a simple position, it's still difficult to hold. But king f5 is what Caruana played. So knight e7 check, now king f4, knight d5 check, king g4, king g6, and MVL is defending very well and finding the right moves to hold the draw. And it's interesting that it's such a simple position, but it's often such positions that even the best players in the world make mistakes in and go wrong. So king f3 with discovered check, king f7, king e4, and now knight e7, and MVL gives Caruana a second bite of the cherry with this move. Correct was knight c7, which is holding after, for example, rook c3 and knight e6. So knight e7 and now king f4, and Caruana again lets MVL off the hook, and it's a draw once more. Correct was to move the rook along the third rank. For example, rook a3, and the idea is simply rook a7, and white is winning. So king f4, and now knight d5 check, king f5, knight e7, king e4, now knight g8. And this is actually the same position as 8 moves earlier, where Caruana played king f5 the last time, but this time he found one of the winning moves, rook h3, and this is another way to win. We looked at rook a3 the last time. So king g6 and now rook a3, and it looks like these moves don't achieve much, but white will eventually force a zugzwang. And it's funny that Magnus Carlsen was commenting on this game along with David Howell and Tanya Sachdev, and the latter two apologized for making the world champion talk about endless variations in such a simple position, as it must be so tedious for him. And he replied that he found it super fascinating, much to their amusement, and it clearly showed the difference between his understanding and grasp of the game and theirs. This position is in fact now a table-based win, and although the commentators weren't using a table base, they were able to find many winning ideas with the help of Magnus. And MVL now blundered with king f7, which makes it easier for Caruana to win. And this is exactly the kind of mistake he's hoping for when he plays out this endgame. A more tenacious defense was knight e7 instead. So now king f4, and white is now mating black when the engine is allowed to run to depth 50. So knight h6, and now rook g3, taking squares away from the king. Knight g8, and now king g4, with the idea king h5, which is threatening rook takes g8 and king g6, and again winning pawn and endgame. We can see the threat here, king h5, and then the threat will be rook takes g8, king takes g8, king g6, and this is obviously just a win. So king g4 is what Caruana played, now knight e7, and now king h5, and the white king has managed to penetrate, and this is decisive. Knight d5, rook f3, threatening g4, g5. So king e6, now g4, and the idea is to play king g6, and the f pawn is going to fall, and black is effectively very close to zugzwang. So king e5, and now simply king g6. And MVL is forced to resign, seeing as there's no way out, because indeed no way out exists. If the knight moves, then f6 will eventually fall, and he can't push the pawn, or he's just losing it with check. And if he checks with the knight, then king g7 and f6 will fall soon. We can see, if he goes knight e7 check, then king g7, now knight d5 to defend the pawn, but simply rook f5, king e4, rook d5, king d5, king takes f6, and white wins. And if he moves the king in the initial position, then it's losing in a similar way. Here, if king e6, then simply rook f1 is going to be zugzwang a few moves later. For example, knight e7 check, king g7, and black has to defend the pawn, so knight d5, now rook e1 check, and he has to move to the d file, and then rook d1 is coming on the next move, and that'll be decisive. For example, rook d6, rook d1, taking the knight and taking the pawn. And again, it's just a simple win in the king and pawn endgame. So it was an epic game and a brilliant win for Caruana. I hope you enjoyed it. Smash those like and subscribe buttons if you did, and I'll see you next time.